All right, so here it goes. This is the story of something I experienced which I cannot explain. What I am about to describe happened over a year ago, but a close friend of mine has convinced me to finally put it out there for others to ponder. Maybe someone can help me make sense of it. The friend and my wife are the only two people that know about this up until now. I would like to make sense of it, but it's not something I can just talk about to people. Let's start with a little background before you ask, what the heck are you doing in the middle of Death Valley alone anyway? I have two professions. I'm an army officer and I'm an adventurer. I do outdoor stuff, often as a way to recharge and refocus. Because leadership does not come naturally to me as an introvert. Being in crowds is bad enough. Organizing training and leading crowds using every last drop of charisma is something else entirely. That's why I get away as much as possible. I seek out places of beauty and solitude, which allow me to rest internally, even if it requires physical exertion to get there. If you're heavily introverted like I am, you know what I'm talking about. So, in the summer of 2016, I had just returned from Africa, where I was on orders. I was drained. I had to get away. I quickly planned a trip through Death Valley. I would take my street-legal dirt bike 15 miles over several days, through the hottest place on Earth during the hottest time of the year, just because I knew it would be the most peaceful and relaxing place I could access. I did mention that I consider adventuring a profession of mine. That's because I spent countless hours adventuring, exploring, and just escaping. I consider myself highly skilled at it, and it is also a paid occupation for me because I document most of it through monetized channels, which, that being said, I have seen some unusual, disturbing, and just plain cool things while I'm out there, especially in the desert. Scavengers that will stalk you for miles, hoping you would drop dead and become a meal, case which appeared to be man-made, hundreds of miles from anything. Traps set to immobilize vehicles or people, old military equipment. You just see a lot of stuff when you're out there. Generally, it all makes sense, though. On this adventure, though, in Death Valley, however, I saw something that just didn't make sense. I have been riding all day through Death Valley. It was a very hot, easily over 120 degrees, and there were very few people out there that day. In fact, I hadn't seen anybody for about half of that day since heading toward Heavy Crater. But I did see one couple in a Mustang just leaving Heavy Crater when I got there. That was it. It's not surprising, though, because of how hot it was and because of how Heavy Crater is. I headed toward Racetrack Player and stopped somewhere between Heavy Crater and Racetrack Player for the night. This is a very far from anything and only accessible by gravel road on one end and unmaintained. It's a harsh trail on the other end. There was nobody out there for obvious reasons. I unpacked my sleeping stuff and had a meal before the sun went down. I took all of my camera batteries out and hooked them up for charge of the night. I also turned my phone off and put it on the chargers. Wow, I left all the stuff by the bike, which was just off the road. I set up my sleeping bag a distance away from the bike in the trail. I wasn't expecting anyone to come by at all. But it was just part of my tactical plan in case of a random bad guy stumbling upon my area. My bright red bike would obviously draw all the attention, and my camouflage sleeping bag would go undetected, allowing me some time and freedom to maneuver on the bad guys. I got my sleeping bag, bringing only the camelback, my folding knife, and my red light tactical flashlight. Everything else was at the bike. It was very peaceful. It was almost silent out there. It was warm and felt really safe and was pretty easy to sleep. However, when you're on your own, you never sleep very deeply. Your mind stays alert and ready that the little things wake you. That night, there was really nothing to wake me. It was nice until about 2 a.m. That's when the event happened. I woke up to the sounds of children. Yes, children, in the middle of freaking nowhere. Here I am being woken up by children talking. It was fully enclosed in my sleeping bag, so for a moment I just stayed still, trying to figure out what the heck I was hearing. It kept going, the undeniable sound of children talking to each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying. It sounded like it was 50 meters off or so. I called out, "Hello!" Still my sleeping bag. It stopped, just for a moment, but continued. Now, I knew for sure there had to be kids there, in the middle of nowhere. I sat up, peeking out of my sleeping bag, and turned my flashlight on. I scanned the direction of the noises, which was the opposite direction of the trail on my bike. There they were. 2 kids, 60 to 70 meters out or so. Opposite direction of the trail in the middle of nowhere. They were walking, kind of wandering, looking lost and sounding lost. I couldn't tell what they were saying. But I had a tone of discussion like they were deliberating to figure out what to do or where to go. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello." They stopped. They looked in my direction. They were looking past me, in my direction, but not at me. Like they heard me, but I wasn't even there. I was illuminating them in a very bright flashlight. They should have been covering their faces, but they were just scanning, like they were looking for me and just didn't see me. They turned back, catch walking, and I just watched them, not sure what to do. Their noises and their images faded into the distance. I just sat there. I didn't know what to think or what to do. It was just so bizarre. After a while, I lay back down and just relax until it started raining at about 5 a.m. That's when I packed up in the darkness and continue with my adventuring into the morning. So that's what I saw. I saw Children Death Valley, over 100 miles from freaking anything, just walking, talking and wandering and then vanishing. Oddly enough, it didn't freak me at the moment. I was more confused than anything. That's why I couldn't make a decision on what to do in that moment. Now looking back, it's freaky. In college, I spent 1 month house-sitting a large hunting estate in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. The nearest town was 20 miles away. It was June 1987. I know it was 87 because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeastern Idaho. I'm not going to say what town it was 22 miles from because they might still own it, and I don't want this to get any more weirder than it already has. It was a pretty big place with a lot of acreage. The guy who was full-time caretaker for the place had just quit. My girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker, but the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered me to pay $12 to go out there, free food, satellite TV, and free booze. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I had never ever been out west, so I took them up on it. It sounded better than doing landscape. I spent the time reading and exploring, playing with dogs, riding the horses, and shooting. Completely uneventful experience. Until that night. After the knocking stopped and the dog stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out at all that much because there were 2 German shepherds inside with me, and I had a gun. I kept it on the nightstand. I've been drinking a little, but not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking someone just simply drove up the wrong way. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone knocking loud and hard in the front door, and the dogs were going nuts. There was no way I was going to answer it. I just grabbed the gun and kept quiet upstairs. The next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and see a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone that had that make or model of a car and told him about what happened the night before. He didn't know anyone, and he called the police directly. The police show up and ask me a few questions and walk around the property for about an hour or so. The car was locked and the police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broke down or not. There was only 1 set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up and told me that the guy who owned the car was missing and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. I don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing or who reported him missing. He was just missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know that much. After 1 month, I go back home, and my girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out on the town several months later, and I asked her if she ever found out what happened to that guy. All she knows is the guy was found dead by suicide 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident, and he was found a couple days after he had killed himself. I asked her how he did it and where he was found, who found him, etc., and I got nothing. I never saw her again. You all know just as much as I know, and I feel your pain. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other. Think many Great Lakes. We have been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and sat phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in, we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in, we are in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in the waves on the lake of the center, started to swell the 2+ feet. Too much for our dinky canoes. We pulled off to a random clearing on the shore, instead of camp in a rush to avoid being totally thrashed by a rainstorm. We just set up camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning, it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp, looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. However, it was absolutely wrecked. Trash was thrown everywhere, tents collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground. At first, you were just disgusted. Like, what assholes would do this? Who would leave their shit out for bear food? The more we looked around, though, the weirder things seemed. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears. But the whole bag was ripped open, despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, like a serious set of hiking equipment. Enough for 2 to 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes. Their long johns ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. It's like somebody just knocked the hell out of there. We waited a couple hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else getting any distress calls. We eventually just left and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or two later we ended up the whole trip early because it just seemed like nobody wanted to be out there anymore. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. First thought was a bear attack, but there was food left uneaten. And we heard bears are way too easy to scare away. I've seen bear attacks on cans before, and it was nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and they're generally pretty easy to scare. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, with half being totally destroyed and half being untouched. I still get it. I've done a lot of camping, hiking, rafting, and biking all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. I started my career working in sawmills back in 2006. I was hired for a portable sawmill in southwest Washington state. This mill was located quite literally in the middle of the forest. It was constructed in the early 70s, and even in the short 30 years of its life, it seemed to have a decent amount of history inside of it. I worked the weekend graveyard shift, 2:30 to 4:30, the following day on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I was a trim drop operator. I had a partner who I worked with, and we were the only two in the area. And his name is Pete. We would take turns rotating through the night. One of us would run the drop, where you drop the bad boards, chunks of garbage, and just about anything else that can't be turned into quality lumber. The boards that would be left to be processed would enter a luggage chain system and then be pulled through a scanner and then a trim box that would cut the lumber to length and then take them to the next area, which was the sorter. The other of us was sit at the operator's console about 20 feet away and watch monitors that display the various parts of the machine and process flow. We rotate every few thousand boards to keep from being fatigued. One night, I was running the drop and Pete was kicked back at the console station, reading away at the newspaper. Everything was going just as normal as ever. When I glanced over, noticed him peering up at the monitor for the outfit with a puzzled look on his face. He jumped up and went walking down to the trimmer saw box and looked around it. He then walked back looking quite concerned, sat down, and shrugged and started reading again. This happened a second time, but by now, it had my attention. I threw up the skids to stop the flow of lumber and walked over to him and asked him what was up. There was a guy standing at the outfit. I went down there to see what the hell was going on. When I got over there, he was gone, he said, with a confused look on his face. This didn't make sense, because this was an area that wasn't accessible unless you stop the machine and activate a catwalk that unfolds from the outfit of the sawbox to allow access to a small platform on the opposite side of the machine. I asked him to point out where this guy was hanging. Pete pointed to the platform, slightly frustrated. I shook my head at him and laughed. Before running back to the drop to continue running lumber, Pete stayed fixed on the monitors now, newspaper folded up and thrown to the side. Not but 5 minutes later go by, before he jumps up and runs around the saw field. This is the time that I threw this kid's up and followed him. By the time I got there, there was nothing. He pointed across the lumber table, which was 32 feet wide, to the platform across the machine and yells, "Who's over there? Weren't allowed to be over here." God damn it. Both of us waited to see the man he had seen on a monitor, but once again, there was nothing. After a minute or so looking on, we decided to move back to our stations. I walked to the console station, glancing at the monitor, seeing nothing, and Pete follows shortly behind. By the time I made the drop to start again, Pete howled. I snapped around and saw him stabbing the monitor with his finger, yelling for me to come back. I ran over and looked to the monitor. Sure enough, there was a guy, standing on the small platform. Pete pouted out. The monitor was small, grainy, and black and white, but we are able to work out that this guy's wearing a tin hard hat, a very dirty and worn button-up long sleeve, with the sleeves either rolled up or ripped off, and everything was dirty, with these very thick denim jeans of a dark color. You just standing there, with his elbows on the handrail, looking at the lumber from the sawbox. "Wait here," Pete yelled, as he stealthily snuck down to the outfit once again, as he closed in on the outbeat area to catch this guy red-handed for being in the area you can't be or shouldn't access while in operation. I looked back and forth at Pete and the monitor about the time Pete made it to the sawbox. The man on the corner looked up into the camera and literally just faded away. I completely lost my shit. I felt the cold chill run down my back, accompanied by all the hairs on my arms standing up. I sprinted as quickly as I could to Pete, exclaiming, "That ain't a guy. It wasn't a fucking guy." Pete just stood there dumbfounded, both of us now looking at the platform with our own eyes. What should we do? I asked, quite dumbfounded and disturbed now. Pete crossed his arms and thought, before deciding we should call our foreman down to tell him the story. We walked back to the operator station, and Pete grabbed the mic on the radio and called for the foreman. We ran up until he arrived, both of us ready to bolt for the sawbox in case we saw the entity again. The foreman showed up after about 5 minutes, and we stopped running and explained why it happened. The foreman didn't look impressed, but he was smiling. He explained that we had just seen one of our old timers. Back in the late 70s, we had a man who worked here who ran the chip bin station, and one day, arrogance got the best of him. Long story short, he got buried in a chip pile and was crushed and suffocated before he could dig himself out. The foreman said he was one of the only people to ever work here and wear a tan hard hat, as homage to his previous career as a logger in the woods. Other operators have had occurrences where they witnessed this entity wandering around different machines. seeming just to watch the flow of lumber. Camping in Wyoming, 2 hours from pretty much anywhere with my dad, my friend, and my dog. This dog was the calmest, albeit quite stupid and nicest dog I've ever had. I never heard her growl or bark at anything. No matter how much she presented a threat to us or her, she just assumed everything was friend or food. It's late at night, my dad's asleep, my friend and I are just hanging around the campfire. Out of nowhere, the dog bolts up, barks once, and starts growling in the direction of the field next to our site. Of course, we're freaking out, trying to figure out what the hell is going on and what she's on about. When we realized there's a group of shadows on the other side of the field, we just sit there, staring at whatever it was. When we hear a conversation, no clue what language it was in. This goes on for about 10 minutes of us staring wide-eyed at the shadows. I didn't think to wake my dad for whatever reason. When the shadows just went away and my dog starts growling, it lays down and falls back asleep. That was the only time that she ever did anything like that in over a decade that we had her. It still freaks me out to this day. This past winter, I hiked on one of the high peaks of the 80KS with a buddy of mine and camped out overnight. Everything was fine the entire first day when we were there. I had great night's sleep and woke up early to hike back to the parking area. On my way back to the trail, my friend and I noticed that someone else had been hiking as well. About a mile after walking, I stopped and saw that my full name, first and last, was drawn into the snow on the side of the footpath. I didn't do it, and neither did my friend. It was snowing a bit throughout the night, and if it was drawn the day before, the snow would have covered it up. We got a bit freaked out and decided to hustle back to our car so we could get out of there. We finally get back to the parking area, and I go to sign myself out of the registry book. When I turn the page where I signed in, I see that someone scribbled out all my information to where you couldn't read it anymore. No one else assigned to the book besides myself for 3 days. I will not be going back there. In 2006, I was working on a trail crew in the Trinity Alps of Northern California. We had 12 people on the crew and a few support staff. At this point, we've been in the woods for about 2.5 months. We had all seen and heard bears, mountain lions, and pretty much anything that you can think of that would make terrifying noises. After dinner one evening, most of us were sitting around the fire, doing whatever, and all of a sudden, there's a huge, loud, agonizing scream sound. It was unlike anything any of us have ever heard. If I had to describe it, I'd call it a mountain lion shriek combined with the horror of a banshee. Everyone was understandably freaked the hell out. It sounded reasonably close, so a few of us, myself included, decided to investigate. About 3 miles from our base camp, there was a creature tied to a tree, absolutely losing its mind. There's a fucking llama. At this point, it's 10 p.m. or so, and 25 plus miles from the nearest trailhead, we find this llama tied to a tree just off the trail. We tried to calm it down without my success and went back to camp. The next morning, the llama was gone. It looked like it had broken its restraints and run off. We kept hearing the horrible llama noises from time to time over the few weeks. Towards the end of the season, a group of hunters passed us on the trail. After chatting for a bit, we found out they tied the llama there because it decided to be stubborn and refused to walk anymore. Apparently, it laid down the trail and would not move, so they left it and decided to come back for it. We figured at that point, the llama was probably dead. We hadn't heard any hellacious llama screams for a few months and didn't really think about it, however. At the end of the season, when we finally got back to the crew van and we were driving out, that damn llama jumped across the road about 30 yards in front of us. Still think about the demon llama from time to time, and I hope he had a fulfilling life in the Trinities. I was camping and hiking in the Okefenokee Swamp. Me and my girlfriend were far from being the only ones there. But when we woke up in the morning, we took out a canoe out to the swamp to explore. It was early. There was a thick layer of fog resting just atop the water. The whole swamp was completely still. No animals inside at all. We paddled down the waterway for a while and saw nothing else. Not a single person. Not a bird. Not anything. We didn't hear a single sound. We had just cornered a bend in the swamp, and we hear it. The loudest guttural bellow I have ever heard in my life. I could feel echo through my chest, a true dinosaur sound. We stopped paddling and looked around for a while, and we looked at each other creeped out. We knew it was an alligator, but we had never heard one that loud. We both looked behind the canoe behind Usand. The backs and eyes of at least 20 alligators had risen. They just surfaced out of nowhere. We slowly started to paddle forward, and we hear more bellows. They come from all around us, and fronts behind the sides, and its sounds are emanating from the bush-covered banks. Each glance behind us, we saw more eyes appear, more scaled mounds breaking the water surface from the banks. Huge reptiles broke the water all around us. We looked back again, as we paddle faster. Easily 40 alligators behind us now. We began to see them appear in front of us, 10 to 15 huge lizards seemingly blocking our path. Then, one of the largest alligators I've ever seen surfaces right where my paddle was going down. I hit the beast on the back of the head, and the thrash he made was incredible. When this massive head hit the side of the small canoe, I thought we were going into the water. Water came into the canoe, and the side dipped down. The beast disappeared below the bow, and we held steady. We paddled forward as we could, right into the dotted landscape of scales and eyes. Behind us, the same guttural roar echoed through my body. As we cut through the field of eyes and backs, we started to see the path clear. The huge monster that had almost cast us eyes bellowed one more time. We turned as we made it past the last of the animals, and we could see the monster staring at us. Watching us leave, all of the other alligators began to sink to the water's floor. The big guy stayed there watching us until he was satisfied we had gone. I guess. Then he disappeared without a sound, back into the black, murky depths of the swamp. We banked the canoe further up the waterway, got out, and just sat for a while, trying to take in what we had just experienced. Last year, I was with a buddy of mine, and we were going to do the Hart Creek Scramble in Alberta. But due to some health conditions he has, it was going to be strenuous to complete. We figured we make it easy and just do the simple trail. Now, we're both climbers and have been to Hart Creek for rock climbing in the past and had a great time, so it wasn't a surprise to see the sporadic climbers on the mountainside as we went. Hart Creek is also pretty popular and easy for people who just want to go for a nice nature walk and maybe have picnics. Anyway, we walked in, enjoying the day watching climbers on our way by. We saw a couple, even doing some multi-pitch climbing, which means basically leapfrogging up the road. We settled in for lunch about a half hour later and left a couple of hours after that, on our way back. I remember seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, oh, someone must have lost this. I picked it up when my buddy got my attention and I looked further downstream. Both climbers. A young man, 29 or so, large later, and his partner were both lying in the creek bed. Rope and harnesses still attached, dead. It was very surreal. We had just seen these people climbing not 2 hours before, making their calls and having a good time. The first reaction I had was that I remember that there was a family right behind us, a husband, a wife, and a young daughter who were playing in the creek on the way down. We ran back and stopped them and explained as quietly as we could. What was ahead, and before we knew it, Looky Loose had come by. It turned out that the husband was an off-duty RNCP officer, so he took control of the situation. I learned later we weren't the first ones on the scene, that the authorities have been called out. It was a very quiet ride back in the town. More details. So, the couple were climbing, and they were both experienced enough, but one was still learning. They attempted to do a dual, lowering maneuver, using each other's weight and feeding the rope through the bear lays. One of them made a mistake and lost their end of the rope, and that was it for both of them. There wasn't a lot of blood, strangely, and they looked very peaceful. I didn't get a good look at the gur. I mostly only saw the guy there. The story ran for a couple of days in the area, talking about the male as the family of the girl didn't want to disclose anything. That was not something I thought I'd see that day, for sure.